Picture this. You're on your first internal medicine rotation.
Oh, a very stressful time for anyone.
Right. And your patient is crashing. Their cultures just came back. And the bug is resistant to literally everything in your standard playbook.
Yeah, your standard beta-lactams are just going to bounce right off at that point.
Exactly. You aren't building a thoughtful, architectural cure anymore. You need a wrecking ball.
And that is exactly when you turn to the heavy hitters of the pharmacy, the cell membrane active antibiotics.
Okay, let's unpack this. For you, the resident about to hit the wards, we are doing a custom deep dive to simplify these notoriously complex rescue drugs.
Right, we're looking at two distinct demolition camps here.
Yeah, first, the gram-negative wrecking balls, which are the polymyxins. That includes Colistin and Polymyxin B. And second, the gram-positive zapper, Daptomycin.
Let's start with those gram-negative wrecking balls.
I always assume these just punched like brute force holes in the bacteria, but the mechanism is actually incredibly specific, isn't it?
It really is. Polymyxins target a very specific component called lipid A.
And that's in the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria, right?
Exactly. Normally, that membrane is held together tightly by calcium and magnesium ions. The polymyxins come in and just aggressively displace those stabilizing ions.
So it's basically like pulling the crucial load-bearing blocks out of a Jenga tower.
Yeah, until the bacterial contents just leak out.
Wow.
And because that structural collapse is so violent, we reserve them for absolute nightmare bugs.
Things like carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales, or CRE, right?
Right, CRE, multidrug-resistant Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter. As any seasoned test taker knows, it's rarely the coverage that catches you out on a board exam.
No, the examiners are not going to hand you an easy point by just asking what covers CRE.
Exactly. They are going to test the gaps in coverage.
The dreaded not active against list. This is pure board bait, so listen up. Polymyxins are universally not active against Proteus,
Avidensia,
Morganella,
Serratia,
and Burkholderia. But wait, why are those specific bugs immune? If they're gram-negative, don't they have that same LPS shield with the Jenga blocks?
They do, but they have evolved a really clever intrinsic defense mechanism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, bugs like Proteus and Serratia can actually modify the structure of their lipid A. They add positively charged molecules like aminorhabinose to the LPS.
Huh. So they change their own charge.
Exactly. That neutralizes the negative charge of the membrane, meaning the polymyxin no longer has an electrostatic attraction to bind there.
It just bounces right off.
It simply bounces off. And examiners love to test this exact mechanism via a clinical vignette.
Oh, I can see it now. They will give you a patient with a highly resistant gram-negative infection, maybe a complicated intra-abdominal abscess, and they'll specify that the culture grew Proteus.
Yep. And if you blindly select colistin just because you saw the phrase multidrug-resistant in the prompt,
you will get the question wrong.
Always check the species. Do not get blinded by the resistance profile.
Okay, that's a huge pearl.
But you have to be careful on rounds. I mean, a common trap is thinking colistin and polymyxin B are just interchangeable.
Yeah, I remember mixing those two up constantly on exams. Since they're in the exact same class, why wouldn't I just use colistin for, say, a bloodstream infection?
Because colistin is actually administered as an inactive prodrug.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it clears rapidly through the kidneys, meaning it achieves incredibly high concentrations in the urine.
Making it your go-to for complicated UTIs.
Exactly. Polymyxin B, however, is given as an active drug.
So it has much more predictable pharmacokinetics in the blood.
Spot on. It stays active in the blood for bacteremia. That's the golden rule. Bloodstream equals polymyxin B, urine equals colistin.
That is a crucial distinction for the boards.
Yeah.
And just for context on how these are dosed, because you will see this in the chart, colistin usually requires a 300 milligram IV loading dose.
Right, followed by a maintenance dose, usually like 180 milligrams IV every 12 hours.
Which makes sense now, given it's a prodrug and needs time to convert. You need that loading dose.
Exactly. Whereas polymyxin B looks completely different. It's dosed in units.
Units?
Yeah, usually 15,000 to 25,000 units per kilogram per day, IV, divided every 12 hours.
Okay, so you likely won't have to calculate those exact unit-based doses on a general internal medicine board exam.
No, probably not. But recognizing why colistin requires a loading dose is a pathophysiological concept that examiners absolutely expect you to understand.
That makes total sense. Okay, let's step back for a second. If these drugs are these incredible membrane-destroying agents that can take out the worst ICU bugs, Why are we holding them back?
Ah.
I mean, why are they strictly last line break in case of emergency drugs?
It's the toxic cost.
Toxic cost.
These drugs are brutal on the human body because, well, human cells have lipid membranes too.
Oh, right, so it's friendly fire.
It is massive friendly fire. The most prominent issue is nephrotoxicity, which occurs in roughly 30% of patients.
30%. That is an incredibly high rate for a severe adverse effect.
It is. It's highly dose dependent too. So you
Right.
must monitor serum creatinine daily early on in therapy, and you have to adjust the dose the very moment renal impairment begins to show.
Man, 30% is massive. I imagine you really want to avoid stacking the deck against the kidneys then.
Absolutely.
Like, if I'm cross-covering a patient on Colistin, what other medications on their profile should make me nervous?
You desperately want to avoid concomitant use with other nephrotoxic agents, particularly aminoglycosides.
Okay, aminoglycosides.
The combination of a polymyxin and an aminoglycoside is practically a guaranteed recipe for acute kidney injury. And the boards will frequently test your ability to recognize that overlapping toxicity.
Good to know. But it's not just the kidneys, right? There's also neurotoxicity.
Yes, occurring in about 10% of patients. It often manifests as paresthesias, peripheral numbness and tingling or slurred speech.
That's scary enough.
But the real danger, the one that causes panic in the ICU, is neuromuscular blockade.
Wait, like paralytics?
Yes. The polymyxins can interfere with the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. So in situations of overdose, or even just impaired clearance due to that kidney damage we just talked about, this blockade can become so severe that it actually causes apnea.
Apnea. It perfectly explains why clinical practice is actively shifting away from the polymyxins.
Exactly. We only use them when we absolutely have to. Whenever antibiotic susceptibilities allow, infectious disease specialists are increasingly replacing polymyxins with newer, safer alternatives.
Like the newer beta-lactam and beta-lactamase inhibitor combinations.
Yes, drugs like ceftazidime avibactam, meropenem-burbactam, and imipenem-relebactam. They offer the necessary coverage against a lot of these resistant gram-negatives, but without the profound risk of destroying the patient's kidneys. But when we look at these clinical protocols, shifting the delivery method from intravenous to inhaled well, it fundamentally changes the risk-reward calculation for the patient.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, actually. The guidelines specify a dosage of 75 to 150 milligrams Q12 delivered via a nebulizer. So you're basically aerosolizing the drug directly onto the airway mucosa. And instead of the severe systemic toxicity we usually associate with IV colistin, the notes highlight that patients generally just experience like mild upper airway irritation.
Yeah, because by nebulizing, you achieve a massive local concentration right at the site of inflammation, but you're keeping the drug out of the systemic circulation.
It just skips the bloodstream entirely.
Exactly, which makes it highly efficient for those specific localized issues.
But if the local concentration is so effective and it avoids all that systemic toxicity, I'm kind of stuck on why it isn't the standard for all severe pulmonary infections. I mean, why did the guidelines explicitly ban inhaled colistin as a monotherapy for pneumonia?
Well, it really comes down to pharmacokinetics, and spatial targeting. The protocols do allow inhaled colistin as the sole treatment for tracheobronchitis or for colonizations of multidrug-resistant bacteria.
Like we see in pulmonary exacerbations of cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, precisely. Because those infections are primarily localized to the bronchial surfaces, so the aerosolized particles easily achieve high concentrations right at the site of the infection.
Ah, I see. So while it works perfectly on the surface of the airways, pneumonia actually involves the alveolars, like the deep lung tissue.
Right.
So the surface level mist just lacks the pharmacokinetic penetration to clear out that deep alveolar exudate.
That is the main limiting factor. The drug simply cannot penetrate deeply enough into consolidated lung tissue when it's just inhaled.
So when a patient develops severe pneumonia from really stubborn pathogens, specifically multidrug-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa or Acinetobacter, the protocol shifts inhaled colistin to an adjunctive role.
It has to be combined with an IV antimicrobial.
Right. But wait, the sources mentioned something here that sounds like a massive clinical red flag. The guidelines actually permit using IV colistin in conjunction with inhaled colistin.
Yes, they do.
But running a notoriously harsh drug through the veins and simultaneously pumping it into the lungs, I mean, doesn't that seem like a fast track to severe whole body toxicity, like an overdose?
It absolutely looks like an overdose risk on paper. But the clinical data supports running both concurrently because of what we discussed earlier regarding absorption.
Because it doesn't enter the bloodstream.
Right. The inhaled colistin doesn't cross over the alveolar capillary barrier into the bloodstream in any significant amount. The systemic burden is almost entirely from the IV dose, meaning you aren't actually doubling the systemic toxicity by adding the nebulizer.
That is wild. Now, if our patient is dealing with a gram-positive threat, say severe MRSA or a nasty VRE infection, we're putting away the polymyxins and reaching for daptomycin.
Right. Daptomycin is a cyclic lipopeptide. And, like the polymyxins, it also relies on calcium to bind to the bacterial membrane.
But it doesn't dismantle the wall like a Jenga tower.
No, instead of thinking of daptomycin as just another bactericidal drug, you can, picture it as a bioelectrical short circuit.
Right. I really like that way of looking at it.
Yeah, it has this lipophilic tail that physically inserts itself into the bacterial cell membrane. And that insertion causes rapid depolarization, so massive potassium efflux.
Exactly. The bacteria basically lose their membrane potential and just die without necessarily living.
Which is brilliant for minimizing the release of inflammatory toxins, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
But getting that tail to insert effectively depends heavily on the concentration, and that dictates your dual dosing strategy. So for standard skin and soft tissue infections, 4 milligrams per kilogram IV daily does the trick.
Okay, but for Staph aureus bacteremia or right-sided endocarditis, that dose scales aggressively, right? Up to 6 to 12 milligrams.
Yeah, exactly. And to explain that scale up to the residents, you have to tell them it's not just about, more bug, more drug. In bacteremia or endocarditis, you're dealing with high inoculum infections.
Right, often with biofilm formation on the heart valves.
Precisely. So you need a massive peak serum concentration to penetrate those barriers and force that membrane depolarization.
So you basically need the pharmacodynamics to just overwhelm the infection burden.
Exactly that.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Because that exact same lipid tail that makes it so effective is also its Achilles heel, especially in the lungs.
Oh, yeah. This is a classic pimping question for rounds. Why can't we use daptomycin for gram-positive pneumonia?
It's all about the pulmonary surfactant.
Right. Surfactant is highly lipid-rich, so it binds directly to daptomycin's lipophilic tail, and it completely inactivates the drug before it can ever touch the bacteria.
That is wild. It's like kryptonite, a perfect example of host physiology just neutralizing a drug's mechanism of action. So lungs are a total no-go zone.
Absolutely. But even when it's working perfectly in the bloodstream, that membrane inserting behavior isn't entirely limited to bacteria, is it?
Wait, it's not.
No. And what's fascinating here is how that translates to collateral effects on host tissues. I mean, while it strongly prefers bacterial membranes, daptomycin can actually interact with mammalian cell membranes, too.
Oh, I see. Particularly skeletal muscle.
Exactly. And this leads to the major adverse events you have to monitor for. Elevated liver function tests, occasionally eosinophilic pneumonitis, but most critically, muscle toxicity and rhabdomyolysis.
Wow. Okay. So what does this all mean for the patient's chart? We can't just wait for a patient to complain of muscle pain before acting, right?
No, you have to be super proactive. Residents must check serum creatine phosphokinase, or CK, at baseline before the first dose.
And then weekly after that, I assume?
Right, and there are hard clinical stops. If CK hits 5 to 10 times the upper limit of normal, and the patient has muscle weakness or pain, you stop the drug.
Okay, but what if they don't have pain?
If it hits 10 times the limit, you stop it, even if they are totally asymptomatic.
Got it. And we have to manage concomitant statin use too, right? Since statins independently risk myopathy.
Yeah, that's a huge point.
Now, another thing that is crucial to emphasize to newer physicians is how dynamic gram-positive bugs can be mid-treatment. We're talking about mid-course non-susceptibility.
Yes, this is wild. You can start with a susceptible isolate, and literally days later, the drug just stops working.
Because the bacteria actually mutate to alter their cell membrane charge, right?
Exactly. They make their surface more positively charged. That physically repels the calcium-dependent daptomycin molecule, so its tail can't insert.
Because they're basically pushing the same magnetic poles together. That is incredible.
Right. So continuous verification of those isolates isn't just a suggestion, it's completely mandatory.
Absolutely.
Let's lock in the ultimate cheat sheet for your rotations. Polymyxins are your gram-negative Jenga block pullers. Colistin for UTIs, Polymyxin B for the blood, and watch those kidneys closely.
And daptomycin is your gram-positive depolarizing zapper. Watch the muscles, pause the statins, and never, ever use it in the lungs.
Keep that framework in your pocket. and you'll be well prepared when the standard playbook fails.
Absolutely.